War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 62, the Battle of Gaugamela. Realizing that I've already discussed the Battle of Syracuse earlier when going over Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War, and more to the point, it's not that interesting a battle by itself, I decided to skip ahead. And this might be an important overall lesson. Creasy's book defines decisive battles that change history, but not necessarily those that displayed any sort of tactical brilliance or insight. Syracuse was decisive because it spelled the beginning of the end for Athenian, and with it Attican dominance of Greece and the rise of the Dorians, led by Sparta. And, as Marathon stopped the expansion of Persia into Greece, the Battle of Gaugamela spelled the end of the ancient Persian Empire and the conquest of Alexander the Great and his Macedonians, who would rule the Near East for centuries, following and establishing Greek language and culture as a standard until Rome supplanted them, but never entirely replaced them. You may recall that Darius III, ruler of the Persian Empire, had fought and been defeated at the Battle of Issus in 333 BC by Alexander's bold charge leading his companion cavalry straight at the god king himself. Darius retreated to Babylon, modern-day Iraq, leaving behind his wife and mother to Alexander's capture of them. Issus, located near the coast in modern Turkey, did not see Alexander's direct pursuit. Rather, he sought to consolidate control of the Levantine coast. Alexander laid siege to Tyre, the ancient Phoenician city, located on both the coast and on a small island 1 mile offshore. In this 6-month campaign, the Macedonians built a 1-mile bridge to finally defeat the garrison. This delay enraged Alexander, who massacred 6,000 and enslaved the 30,000 remaining of the garrison. He then moved on to the ancient Philistine city of Gaza, now occupied by Arab mercenaries employed by Darius and serving as the guardians of the Egyptian breadbasket. As Gaza defended Egypt to the south, the southern defenses were the weakest, and the Macedonians were well trained in siege warfare following 6 months at Tyre. The mercenary force fell quickly, and, having refused to surrender, all men were executed, and women and children sold into slavery. Alexander then pushed onto Egypt, where his brutal earlier peace terms with Tyre and Gaza ensured the Persian satrap Mazaces quickly surrendered without a fight, saving himself and the nation from slaughter. These 2 years dedicated to securing the coast allowed Alexander the freedom to push inland and finish off Darius, and ultimately the 220-year-old Achaemenid Empire forever. Darius was feeling the heat, and having seen both the prowess of the Macedonians, as well as Alexander's bravery firsthand, sought a negotiated peace on very favorable terms. According to Plutarch, writing so long after the battle that it renders the historical accuracy questionable, Darius apparently offered a daughter in marriage, all land west of the Euphrates, and literally tons of silver. So tempting was this offer that Alexander discussed it with his advisors, with one, notably, Parmenion, stating, and I paraphrase here, "If I were Alexander, I would take it," with Alexander replying, in typical badass fashion, "And if I were Parmenion, I would accept it." Alexander departed Egypt to find and destroy Darius and his army, reaching the Euphrates River sometime in the summer. Eschewing the direct route, he stayed north in the mountains to avoid the heat and to maximize foraging opportunities for his army. He crossed the raging Tigris River, considered impassable at that particular time. He was mere miles from Darius, who was preparing the battlefield at Gaugamela, also known as Arbela, to maximize the benefit to his larger cavalry-heavy army by removing obstacles, having been confined at Issus and unable to bring to bear his superior forces. Alexander chose to fight on the enemy's preferred ground. Not preferred, but this is Alexander we are talking about. Where Gaugamela actually is unknown. We do know it is in modern Kurdistan on the ancient plains of Nineveh. The numbers of Macedonians participating in the battle are considered to be fairly well known, with about 31,000 hoplites, 9,000 light infantry, and 7,000 cavalry. Darius had assembled a hodgepodge of whatever the empire could provide, and the true numbers are unknown. There were thousands of Greek mercenaries, Armenians, Bactrians, and of course the 10,000 immortals who comprised the king's bodyguard, an elite reserve of forces. Low estimates are roughly equal to Alexander, and the highest estimates over 1 million. The latter can be discounted, and it would appear the Persians had roughly double the number of men. But aside from the Greek mercenaries and immortals, more poorly trained and equipped than Alexander's forces. Unquestionably, the Macedonians were outnumbered in both cavalry and heavy infantry. Included in the Persian cavalry were scythed chariots, which required clear ground to operate. Much of the reason Gaugamela was the chosen site for the battle was Darius refused to leave, having painstakingly prepared the battlefield specifically for his chariots. Alexander realized this, and his plans focused on anticipating Darius's moves. Specifically, Darius wanted to fight on his preferred chariot-friendly ground. So Alexander drew up in two sections, the aforementioned Parmenion on the left and Alexander commanding the light infantry and companion cavalry on the right. The center of both sides consisted of heavy infantry. Darius himself fought in the center, surrounded by his Greek mercenaries and 10,000 immortals. For Darius, his strategy was to use the wide-open terrain to his advantage, having been confined at Issus. Darius assumed Alexander would attempt to recreate his daring charge and use his chariots and infantry to deny him. Alexander, knowing Darius's cavalry advantage demanded favorable terrain, and Darius wishing to be a defensive rock upon which the audacious Alexander would break his army, sought instead to change the tactical situation by maneuvering to his far right, beyond the prepared ground, and into terrain increasingly disadvantageous to Darius. Parmenion on the left was tasked with holding along with the phalanxes in the center. Darius saw Alexander's movement and was forced to initiate the attack. The mobility and mass of the Persians nearly won the battle nonetheless. Only Alexander's personal leadership and timely generalship managed to fend off the Persians' attacks. While the phalanx is magnificent in the defense, the cavalry and light infantry of Alexander's right wing was incapable of effective defense. Instead, pinpoint counterattacks and fierce fighting kept the Macedonian right wing whole. Alexander's entire reserve was utilized in maintaining this main effort, while Parmenion's troops suffered horribly. Darius was attacking on both wings. While he had the advantage of numbers on both sides, it was, in retrospect, the critical error. Had he ignored Parmenion and focused solely on Alexander, he most certainly would have had the mass to break the companions and the accompanying light infantry. Likewise, had he ignored Alexander and trusted to his heavy infantry to protect him and focused all his efforts against Parmenion, the Macedonian left would have certainly given way, and Alexander would have been forced to abandon his attempt at the flanking attack and either organize the retreat of his forces or consolidate for a defensive stand. Darius failed massing effectively, whereas Alexander just managed his economy of force on the left while utilizing the superior mobility of cavalry and light infantry on the right to maneuver outside the unfavorable ground and Darius's predictable early attack disrupting his plans. The critical fight was on the Macedonian right, and Aretes, commanding the light cavalry, brought his forces to bear, which caused a break in the Persians. Where exactly he struck is unknown. As light cavalry is usually for scouting and pursuit, not attack, I suspect he used the superior speed and mobility to threaten the rear of the Persians, though this is pure guesswork on my part. As always, an attack from an unexpected direction can have disproportionate effects upon an unprepared enemy. His cavalry routed, Darius sent his chariots to attack Alexander, probably as the Persians' reserve. Alexander's maneuver outside the prepared ground rendered their attack less effective, and here the peltists accompanying Alexander broke up the initial thrust with javelins and other missiles. Those chariots that did survive the initial barrage were ineffective against the thin lines of the light infantry, who simply moved aside, letting the hard-to-turn chariots roll past, taking jabs at the horses and drivers as they did so. Wounded, disorganized, and isolated, those few chariots left after this attack were easy prey for the remaining light infantry and servants to the cavalrymen. Alexander, like all great generals, knew the time for decisive action had arrived after the impotent attack by Darius's prized chariots. Parmenion was holding on the left, as was the Macedonian phalanxes in the center. Alexander brought up the remaining infantry reserve in the second line to mass for a decisive attack. This wasn't a flank, rather a penetration of Darius's left flank. A wedge with Alexander at the apex, flanked by his cavalry and mass provided by infantry behind. Reminiscent of Issus, he charged directly for Darius. The bulk of the Persian infantry was engaged with the Macedonian hoplites and unable to assist. The cavalry was either spent on the left or, again, too engaged with Parmenion on the right of the Persian lines, and it was left to the immortals and Greek mercenaries who, lacking any cavalry themselves, and left in ground deliberately favorable to cavalry action, to counter Alexander's attack, which they failed to do. And, yet again, Darius fled the battlefield. Alexander with cavalry could have pursued, but declined as Parmenion announced he was hard-pressed and close to breaking. Alexander feared losing his army more than an escaping Darius, and declined the pursuit to fall upon the rear of the remaining Persians, routing and slaughtering most that remained. The desperate situation of the Persians actually led to the hardest fighting and highest casualties to Alexander's companion cavalry. Again, returning to Sun Tzu, the surrounded Persians had but little choice to fight hard for their lives and the chance to retreat. Of the more than 100,000 Persians, less than 5,000 are believed to have escaped. Parmenion was tasked with sacking Darius's baggage while Alexander futilely pursued Darius, who escaped, promising to raise another army further east. But the god king's aura had been destroyed. He was no longer the heir to a centuries-old dynasty, but a twice-defeated coward, whose empire was being systematically swallowed by the seemingly invincible Alexander. One of his satraps, Bessus, murdered Darius. Alexander was ironically saddened by the news, regicide being deemed a far greater crime than fighting in battle. Alexander gave full funeral honors to Darius while hunting down, torturing, and eventually executing Bessus in what is today Afghanistan. Fearing Alexander's wrath, his own men handed him over. The rest of the Persian satraps gave their full loyalty to Alexander, who allowed most of them to keep their fiefdoms. So why was Gaugamela so important? It solidified the dominance of Western Greek culture in the Near East, creating the Hellenistic Era. Following Alexander's death and the carving up of his kingdom among his generals, they ruled the Levant, Persia, and Babylon, with varying degrees of Greek cultural infusion. This expansive, though decentralized cultural empire dictated the known world and shaped it into the form we recognize today. Remember, it was the descendant of the Greek general Ptolemy from whom Cleopatra was descended. This period was marked with nearly endless wars between the various empires led by Alexander's generals' descendants, until finally supplanted by the rising Romans, who borrowed heavily from Greek culture while developing their own. And this closes out the Greek era for now, and requires a future discussion of the Romans, a subject so vast and rich I am hesitant to tread there. I'd like to, again, thank my subscribers: Austin, Christopher, George, Dennis, Brian, Ken, Paul, Dave, Jeff, William the 49th, and my newest subscriber, Squeezy McBoomy. At some point, I would like to have a female subscriber, but this apparently just isn't that kind of podcast. Here's to hoping in the future. And my thanks to all of you who join us each week. Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.